And it was quite a prophetic sermon, and some thought that it would really be a blessing for us to have it again. But my mind automatically and inevitably went to John chapter 4 over the last days. For in that chapter we also had somebody who was desperate for water in more ways than one. I'm talking about the Samaritan woman, and it's one of John's longest discourses. He writes the story in quite a bit of detail from verse 1 in that chapter right up to verse 42. And it becomes quite complicated and quite involved, this dialogue that Jesus has with the Samaritan woman. In the first few verses, we don't have the women introduced to us yet. No, we first have a little bit of background, and then in John chapter 4, as this chapter begins, we are told that Jesus was pretty peeved off with the Pharisees. And I was fascinated when I read that, because it looks like as from early on in Jesus' ministry and mission already, did the Pharisees get their backs up. I'm not always sure of the chronological order of events in John because it differs so much from the synoptics, but it looks like it's safe to say that the Samaritan woman incident happened early on in the days of Jesus' 3-year ministry. So we can safely assume that it looks like even from the very start of Jesus announcing and demonstrating the kingdom of God, was he irritating groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. As for my personal opinion, I never liked the Pharisees very much because they just weren't fair, you see. Neither do I have much time for the Sadducees because that bunch was always so sad, you see. It's a bit early in the morning, I get it if you don't catch my jokes. We have there, at the beginning of John chapter 4, the Pharisees already feeling quite antagonized by Jesus, by what he was doing and by what he had to say. Not only we have the Pharisees starting to stalk Jesus, we also have another line there which tells us that Jesus was tired. And it's important that you know this as part of the context because it makes the incident of the Samaritan woman so much wonderful and so much meaningful. Jesus was at the well of Jacob, not necessarily for some water, but to catch 40 winks. In fact, we are told that he was leaning against the well for a midday nap while his disciples had run into town to get some takeaways because they were hungry. But Jesus just said, I just want what did Winston Churchill say, a power nap, eh? Remember Churchill said that it was power naps that got him through the war. So Jesus was having a power nap there, seemingly in the middle of nowhere, where Jacob's well was found, and it was midday, time for lunch. Jesus finds a woman coming to the well at the most unusual time. Who goes to a well, or who at least went to the well in New Testament times, in the middle of the day? Shouldn't water be looked for and fetched early in the morning, when the day's chores begin, like making breakfast and having to wash clothes in order to hang them up, to catch the best rays of the sun? Jesus seemed to have known right from the beginning that there was a reason, an iffy reason for why this woman was coming when there was no one else there. The townsfolk would have been to the well early that morning, probably even before sunrise, to collect their water for the day. So this woman must have very cleverly calculated when it would be most quiet at the well in order for her to make her unpopular appearance. And so what transpires after that is this haunting dialogue between a Jewish male and a Samaritan female. Now, even as I say that, I'm not sure if I get how much these two groups hated each other. And I remember when I did a trial sermon on this at college 20 years ago, my lecturer wanted to know from me if I had studied anything of the background between why these groups so hated each other and were bitter enemies. And I thought, of course, that it would be a wise answer to give to the professor, saying, because of the age-old feud between the two groups. He wasn't very impressed because of, in fact, that was no answer at all. I have done a bit of Googling since then, and I have found out that the core of the problem between the Jews and the Samaritans had surfaced when the Samaritans had chosen a different place of worship. The Orthodox Jew believed that the temple, the place of Israel's worship, the heart of who they were, had to be erected on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. For them it was no compromise and no negotiation. That is where God had to be worshipped in spirit and in truth. And yet for some or other reason the Samaritans maintained that Mount Gerizim in Samaria was the place. And so for many, what looks like centuries, these two groups did not see eye to eye. In New Testament times, it was a big taboo for a Jew to speak to a Samaritan. And that is why Jesus irks some people by giving parables like that of the Good Samaritan. Because it was so controversial. Because it was so life-altering. Because it was so world-shattering. The first point then I want to make is this. We see in the story of the woman at the well that Jesus was a boundary breaker. For it doesn't look like this thought ever entered his mind. I shouldn't be talking to this person because she's a Samaritan, let alone the fact that she was also a woman. We live 2,000 years later in an enlightened world where men and women are equal, where races are equal, people from different nationalities are all seen as equally human. But it wasn't the case in New Testament times. Not only was there the issue of her being a Samaritan, there was also the issue of her being a female. So double trouble for Jesus, in other words. But there's no mention of him being fazed by it in the slightest. Let me explain to you the issue of Jews and Samaritans so that you can understand how severe it was. There was Galilee in the north. On this side there would have been the River Jordan with the Dead Sea there at the bottom. So let's say this is Galilee, the northern part of Israel. Then there would be Samaria, and here in the south there would be Judah, Jerusalem, the Qumran community, etc., etc. Jesus, of course, grew up here in the north, in Galilee, in Nazareth, where many Jews lived. Every time when the average Jew had to attend some kind of festival or family event in the south, in Jerusalem, they would refuse to walk on Samaritan soil. So they would cause for themselves a whole lot of effort. Jews wanting to trek from Galilee in the north to Jerusalem in the south would cross the Jordan to the east, would cross Jordan, avoid Samaritan soil on the western side of the Jordan River, and then when they got to Jerusalem territory, would then cross the Jordan in order to enter the city from the east. This issue had become so serious that a Jew from the north didn't want to put his foot there where Samaritans were walking. Can you understand the barrier which Jesus is addressing in this passage? Jesus ignores age-old hatred. He's not interested in identity and nationality and culture and race. All that he wants is for this woman to know that she is loved. And that, dear friends, is the gospel. Not only did Jesus look past the fact that she was of Samaritan origin, There was also the whole controversy of whether he should or should not be talking to a female. You see, in New Testament times, the issue had gone out of control. Women were frowned on, looked upon with negativity and disdain. There was a group of ultra-Pharisees who had earned for themselves the name of the bruised ones. For when they were walking in the street or in a park and perhaps saw a woman coming towards them, they would close their eyes because they didn't even want to look at women in their sight. So as they closed their eyes, they would walk into a wall or into a tree or into a rock, and they would actually bump their heads. So society ended up calling them the bruised ones. Heaven forbid they ever came face to face with somebody of the opposite sex. There's an Orthodox Jewish prayer which read, it's a prayer by males obviously. Oh God, I thank you for not making me a Greek, a slave, or a woman. This is the kind of context in which Jesus lived. This was the accepted norms of New Testament society. And Jesus, in spite of having got the backs up of the Pharisees, in spite of being tired, in spite of being alone with his disciples in town buying lunch, he makes time for this woman and makes her feel like the most precious person in the world. It's just like Jesus to do that. Jesus is a Savior who breaks down barriers and who destroys man-made boundaries. The church has so often been guilty of propaganda and of bureaucracy and of man-made laws that we obsess over. And know what Jesus' response is to that? I don't have time for this. Because there's ministry to be done and there are souls to save. I often wonder what Jesus would say about modern day society. Perhaps he would say yes to those the church has rejected. And perhaps he would welcome those who the church closes their doors to. Careful, people of God. Careful. The second thing I think we need to zoom in on when it comes to this passage is not only Jesus breaking the barriers of talking to a female and reaching out to her and ignoring the fact that she's a Samaritan. We also have the crux of this passage, which is Jesus offering her the living water. Now, throughout the scriptures, water is a big thing. All the writers of both the books in the Old Testament and New Testament made a big fuss of water. In fact, right in Genesis 1 in the creation story, we have that fetching verse where we are told that the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. There have also been moments in the history of Israel which had been really desperate and dry, dare I say. Like Exodus 17, where they begged Moses to make a plan to get them some water. They had arrived at a place which was very deserty, and they came to Moses and they even said to him, you know what, if you don't get us some water, we want to go back to Egypt. We were happy enough there, and at least we could have a drink of water. Jesus offers this woman living water. And at first, she doesn't understand. But you know who would have understood? Ezekiel. For Ezekiel, years before, what? 600 years before Jesus? Knew exactly what this living water is able to do. Because he had that fresh vision, excuse the pun. He had that fresh vision of this river of life flowing from the temple. You know who would have known exactly what Jesus was talking about, if not the Samaritan woman? John. At the end of the first century, when he was writing his vision, which we call the Revelation, the last book in our New Testament canon. You would have known exactly what Jesus was referring to when Jesus was talking of the water of life, because also John refers to this river of life on whose banks trees flourish, trees that bear their fruit in every season, trees whose leaves are for the healing of the nations, let alone for the healing of the individual. Water is such a powerful, powerful symbol in the Bible. We have the baptisms of Jesus, the baptisms performed by John the Baptist and by, or nowadays they talk about John the Baptizer, lest we think that he belonged to the Baptist church. So let me correct myself, Ken. There's John the Baptizer, and they of course all performed these baptisms of repentance. Jesus himself in Luke chapter 2 went through his own baptisms, which we see as an ordination, as a commissioning. So water has always played a major part in the life of ancient Israel. Here Jesus, in this fascinating conversation, doesn't talk about the waters of creation, or the water that came from the rock, or even the waters of baptism. He's talking about some kind of river, some kind of fountain that bubbles in within us when we come to understand who he is, namely Messiah. For there's this incredible verse in this passage. I don't have time to read it to you now, but as this woman says to Jesus, I know that one day Messiah will appear. Guess what Jesus' reaction to that is? You know what, lady? I'm going to have to let you in on the secret of the universe. I might as well tell you now, because it looks like you are just waiting for a surprise. And Jesus says to her, probably in a whispered voice, you know this person that you are waiting for, this Messiah. I am he. And right then and there, this woman's world changes forever. You see, this living water is offered to every single person today. And when I talk about single, I don't mean unmarried like me, I mean every individual, okay? This water's invitation comes to you. There where you are sitting, perhaps with a parched heart and a forlorn spirit. This water wants to seep into your forgotten life and bring you healing, and bring you restoration, and bring you wholeness. And can I take the risk of saying, this water wants to seep into every dark, broken place of your life, and it wants to bring you joy. Jesus can't stand the fact that some of us are not drinking deeply from his river of life. The living water was offered to this Samaritan woman, and her story was never the same again. If you are not somebody who has quenched your thirst with the living water that Jesus gives, your life is not what it could be. Your life is not what it should be. The last thing that I want to say, because it's 1 minute to 9. The last thing I wanted to say, you can leave, Linda, if you want to. The last thing I think I must comment on is this. John didn't have to tell us that the woman, after her chat with Jesus, was so overwhelmed by him, was so impressed by him, was so drawn into whatever he had to give, that she ran into town, leaving behind her water jar. Those words are written there. John could have just, to keep the story shorter and sweeter, could have just said she ran into town. But there is a comma after the word she. She says, she, comma, leaving her water jar behind, comma, ran into town. Is that verse 28, Uncle Jeff? I see your Bibles open. Is it verse 28? Yeah, round about there. John goes to the trouble of telling us that the reason for why she had come to the well in the first place now was forgotten, left behind. She had a different tiding to take into town. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her to tell others about her discovery. And if one continues reading that passage for the rest of John chapter 4, you will see that it says there that many Samaritans came to faith in Jesus because of this woman's testimony. Yeah. And I don't know why, but I just tingle all over when I tell you that. Many Samaritans, I'm going to say that again because I didn't get the response the first time that I wanted. Many Samaritans, because of this woman's testimony, came to faith in Jesus. There's something significant about her leaving her water jar there on the dusty ground. It's almost like it becomes a burial site of her old life, don't you think? Perhaps that clay jar is like a tombstone where she leaves behind her old existence of not being sure where God should be worshipped, of not even being certain why the Samaritans and the Jews didn't get along in the first place. All she wanted to do was to run into town and tell others of this exciting, extraordinary thing, or should I say person, she had found. The Christ. Isn't it mind-boggling that one of the very first people to know that Jesus was the Christ was a Samaritan female? I could go on, maybe this is a sermon for another time, I could go on about the scandal of who she was. Remember, she had 5 children, not a set husband sort of thing, and Jesus pointed out that all her children looked like a different daddy. But that's a sermon for another time. I think I've said enough for this morning. This woman's life was changed as only Jesus can change a life. That water jar lying on the floor reminded me of the tax collector's booth that Matthew left behind. Matthew chapter 9. That clay jar on the floor reminded me of the boat of Peter and Andrew they left behind after Jesus called them. Remember? I always have this vision of how the boat would have said Zebedee and sons, and how after Zebedee's sons left, he had to Tipex out the bit that said and sons. It was only Zebedee remained. That clay jar on the ground reminds me a lot of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8, leaving behind her own sinful life for the new life that only Jesus can give. In Psalm 42, I end with this. In Psalm 42, we have these words, as the deer pants for cooling streams of water, so my soul pants for thee, O Lord. And we have romanticized that. We even sing it in that moving chorus, as the deer pants for the water. And I think in our minds we have this very beautiful romantic picture of a little desert deer in the ancient Near East with some green lush trees, with a running brook coming by, this little cute animal similar to Bambi, you know, remember Bambi? Comes and quenches its thirst, this pool of water. I'm not sure if that's the right concept for Psalm 42. For you know what I see when I read that, as the deer pants for the water, or to drink from cool water, I see a desperate animal, panting, lying weak and exasperated on sand. No trees, no cute little running brook. I see desert, and I see a scorching sun, and I see an animal which is about to die, with its ribs sticking out, minutes away from breathing its last. That's the idea with which I read Psalm 42. As the deer pants. Wat is die Afrikaans? Soos 'n hert, né? Soos 'n wildsbok smag na water, so smag ek na U, o Heer. In your desperation, in your confused and complicated life, in your loneliness, or in your sense of guilt or remorse, or in whatever fears are crippling you at this stage in time, I want you today to say yes to the streams of living water that come from Jesus, the fountain of life. And when you come eyeball to eyeball with Him, I pray that you will drink deeply. There's no record of Jesus ever meeting up with this woman again. In all the chapters of the rest of John, it doesn't look like their paths cross a second time. But me, with my imaginative mind, I've made up a story of them seeing each other again. Perhaps unexpectedly, perhaps at the temple, perhaps at a festival, or perhaps just in the local coffee shop. I have a very strong suspicion that when Jesus saw her again, she was singing a song of victory, a song of freedom, a song of life, a song of the water.